Yes, I am Tom Solomon. I'm co-coordinator of 350 New Mexico. We're the New Mexico chapter of 350.org. And I'm so pleased to be here at the Science March today because 350's name actually comes from science. It comes from a question that our co-founder Bill McKibben asked of pretty famous climate scientist James Hansen around 2008, which was, what is the maximum level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we can tolerate before we get to a global tipping point for the climate? And that number is 350 parts per million. Unfortunately, we breached that level of carbon dioxide in 1988, the year that Dr. Hansen testified before Congress to sound the alarm that our planet and all life on Earth was in danger. Because for all of human history, since Homo sapiens appeared about 200,000 years ago, we'd never seen levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere above 280 parts per million. And this greenhouse gas held at that level for about 10,000 years or so, keeping the climate fairly stable within 1 degree or so, and allowing the rise of civilizations that developed agriculture and cities and indoor plumbing and cars and every bit of modern life that we live today. But since we started burning carbon for electricity, and especially since we've been digging up ancient carbon like coal, oil, and natural gas, carbon dioxide in the air has been building up at alarming rates. And we now emit about 41 gigatons, that's billion tons of CO2 every year, increasing carbon dioxide levels by about 2 parts per million every year, warming the planet to record levels, but also providing enormous profits for a few people at the top of companies like ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Koch Industries. Well, Bill McKibben published one of the early books on climate change called The End of Nature, published in 1988, also the same year that James Hansen testified. And like many of us, he thought that publicizing the science and the dangers of the increase in carbon and the impacts on global warming, on species extinction, on drought and floods and wildfires and the spread of diseases like the Zika virus, once confined to the tropics but no longer. He thought that sounding the alarm would be enough and that our leaders would act to save our future, to save our children. But he was wrong, because that's not how society works, especially not when the actions required would cut into the profits of the oil companies that are making hundreds of billions in revenue every year, the largest and most powerful companies in the world. Because what they did instead was to take a tiny fraction of those profits and spend it on the most significant and pernicious disinformation campaign in history, casting doubt on the certainty of climate science, playing for time, pushing for a few more decades of making those billions of dollars. And that campaign was wildly successful. And it goes on to this day. And in fact, it has captured an entire political party, including the current occupant of the White House. So in 2008, Bill McKibben, May Beauvais, and a group of former students from Middlebury College in Vermont started 350.org to build an international climate movement devoted to building the grassroots organization necessary to fight the enormous power of the oil and fossil fuel industries, because that's what it will take to survive. And so that brings me to climate activism. 350.org has built itself around campaigns to confront the fossil fuel industry and their plan to wreck the planet. Big iconic campaigns like the fight against the Keystone XL pipeline, which would accelerate the extraction of the world's dirtiest carbon-intensive oil, which is destroying the habitat, forests, and rivers, and the indigenous communities in Alberta, Canada. But also the global divestment campaign, which you can find at gofossilfree.org, which has resulted in over 1,000 university and pension funds and churches and cities and counties representing $8 trillion in investment pledging to divest from fossil fuel stocks. And that has gotten their attention. And also big events by the now yearly People's Climate March, which in 2015 culminated in 400,000 people on the streets of New York City leading up to the Paris Climate Conference. And now people around the world are rising up, shocked at the recurring disasters linked to the warming climate, the massive rainfall events and flooding that is happening as we speak in Iowa and Missouri, and the increasingly powerful hurricanes, and then the heat effects, the drought and the heat waves and the wildfires, like the one last Thanksgiving that tore through the town of Paradise, California, destroying that town of 27,000 people and killing 88 of them, many of them trying to escape in their cars, burned alive. The momentum for bold action has been building at an increasing rate in the last several years, spurred on by those headlines and by people's personal experiences. Polls that show that 69% of Americans now say that they are worried or alarmed about the climate crisis. The Paris Climate Accords of 2015 brought every country in the world together to pledge action to keep warming between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. And last year's IPCC report on 1.5 degrees issued an urgent warning that worldwide we must cut our greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 and to zero by 2050. And finally, that warning that we had 12 years left to take bold action seems to have penetrated, and the movement is accelerating. Young people especially are demanding that adults stop stealing their future. Yesterday, the school strike movement came to Albuquerque with middle school, high school, and college students marching down Central, shutting down traffic for a full hour, demanding action. And the Extinction Rebellion in the United Kingdom has shut down roads and bridges in London and all around Britain for days at a time, and they are literally gluing their bodies to the entrance of the Shell oil building, and they dumped buckets of fake blood in front of 10 Downing Street, and they stripped naked in Parliament, until finally this week their Parliament actually passed a resolution declaring a climate emergency. And in Washington, D.C., the Sunrise Movement occupied Speaker Pelosi's office, demanding a Green New Deal and a select committee on the climate crisis. 350 New Mexico supports this demand, and we have a flyer on the Green New Deal at our table where you can also sign our petition. We support it because the Green New Deal is the first plan that is large enough to address the enormous scope of this crisis. It calls for both a 10-year national mobilization for 100% clean energy, zero greenhouse gas emissions, and sustainable farming, and many other climate solutions, but it also calls for a restoration of equity and climate justice to our society. And let me tell you why I think that's important. The next 10 to 30 years and the rest of this century that I won't live to see will be very rough. The coming droughts and heat waves will hit farms so badly that by mid-century, if we don't mobilize, we're likely to hit a global calorie deficit, where we literally cannot grow enough food on this planet to feed everyone on Earth. If we let this continue, there will be a point where famine, flooding, rising seas, disease, and climate refugees will cause so much strife and war that our societies will be torn apart, and the mobilization that we do need to build 100% clean energy and the resilient infrastructure to survive the climate crisis will be impossible. If our planet's wealth is still concentrated in as few hands as it is today, we will not survive. So we have to ensure that people have health care and food and decent housing and economic security, because without those things, the demagogues among us will point to the refugees fleeing from the regions where the climate crisis is the worst and tear it apart. And we see it happening already. So we support the Green New Deal. And here in New Mexico, there is another clear and present danger, and that's fracking and the unconventional oil extraction happening both in northwest New Mexico around Farmington and the Chaco Canyon area, and in southeastern New Mexico in the Permian Basin around Hobbs and Carlsbad. Fracking and drilling is releasing huge quantities of methane, a greenhouse gas 84 times as damaging to the climate as carbon dioxide. And they vent and they leak it from wells and pumps and compressor stations, along with carcinogens like benzene, right next to homes and schools where people live. And so we also support the bill to declare an immediate 4-year moratorium on any new fracking permits in New Mexico to give us time to assess the impacts on air, water, and health so we can develop meaningful regulations to protect us. Senator Antoinette Sedillo Lopez introduced that bill, Senate Bill 459, in February, but it failed in the first committee. But she and we will keep pushing it, including getting it heard during this summer's interim committees. If you sign our petition, we'll let you know when those committees will come up and how you can help. Because activism works, and it's the most important thing that we can all do. It was activism and 3 years of pushing at the grassroots level that got New Mexico to pass the Energy Transition Act, committing our utilities to hit 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045, which PNM then followed up saying that they could in fact do it 5 years earlier, getting it done by 2040. So in addition to the good and useful personal actions that we all take, like putting solar panels on our roof, changing our light bulbs, and eating less meat, I ask you to call your representatives at the federal, state, and local levels and demand urgent action. Show up at candidate town halls and ask them, what is your plan? Push for bold solutions like the Green New Deal and the fracking moratorium and an end to all fossil fuel subsidies. And over the coming weeks, look for announcements from 350 and others of adult climate strikes to occur later on in this year, because we do need to disrupt business as usual, and we need to back up the kids who are doing the heavy lifting. And finally, we must make every election a climate election and vote every single time. We can do this, but to change everything, it's going to take all of us pushing for the massive change we need and an emergency mobilization, because we are literally out of time. Thank you.